Some lives are like a whisper. They come and go, barely noticed. And then, there are lives like a thunderstorm, lives that shake the earth, move the skies, and forever change the destiny of millions. Nelson Mandela lived such a life. Born in a forgotten village of Africa, he would grow up to stand against one of the most brutal systems of oppression the world has ever known, apartheid. He would suffer chains, isolation, humiliation, and 27 long years in a prison cell. Yet, he would emerge not with bitterness, but with forgiveness. Not with vengeance, but with a vision of peace. How does a man, broken by prison walls, rise to unite a nation? How does a boy, who once herded cattle barefoot in the fields, grow into a leader who shook hands with kings and inspired humanity? This is not just the story of Nelson Mandela. It is the story of resilience. It is the story of hope. It is the story of how one man's courage taught the world the meaning of freedom. Before we walk through his journey, let us pause and imagine. Imagine a small boy in the heart of Africa, under the golden sun, surrounded by rolling hills and endless sky. He is not yet a hero. He is not yet a leader. He is simply a child, curious and restless, unaware that destiny has chosen him. This is where our story begins. In the year 1918, in a tiny village named Mvezo, a child is born. His name is Rolihlahla, a name that in his Xhosa language means troublemaker, a name that will one day echo across the world as Nelson Mandela. The African sun rises over the rolling hills of Transkei, painting the sky in colors of gold and fire. In a tiny village called Mvezo, a baby boy opens his eyes for the first time on the 18th of July, 1918. His parents name him Rolihlahla, a name that means troublemaker. Little did they know, this child would grow up to trouble the chains of injustice itself. Mandela was born into the Thembu royal family of the Xhosa people. His father, Gadla Henry Mafekanyiswa, was a chief, a man of authority and tradition. His mother, Nosekeni Fanny, was gentle yet strong, a woman rooted deeply in her faith and her people's values. Though born into dignity, the young Rolihlahla did not live a life of luxury. He wore no shoes, he herded cattle barefoot, he fetched water from the stream, and learned to play with sticks and stones in the wide fields of Kunu. It was in those fields, chasing cows and listening to elders around the fire, that Mandela first heard the stories of African warriors, stories of his ancestors who had resisted invaders, who had fought to defend their land. These tales sparked in him a fire, a belief that life must be lived with courage. But childhood was not without loss. When Mandela was only 12 years old, his father passed away. It was a turning point. Without his father's protection, Mandela's world changed, yet destiny opened another path. He was sent to live with the regent of the Thembu people, Chief Jongintaba Dalindiabo. From a barefoot village boy, Mandela now entered the world of leadership and responsibility. At the regent's great hut, he watched decisions being made. He saw disputes settled, justice delivered, and he realized that leadership was not about power, but about serving the people. At school, a new identity awaited him. On his first day, his teacher gave him an English name, Nelson. It was a colonial practice, one that stripped children of their African names and gave them European ones. Mandela would carry this name all his life, though in his heart, he never forgot Rolihlahla, troublemaker destined to challenge the world. So there he stood, Nelson Mandela, a boy of two worlds, one rooted in the traditions of his ancestors, and the other forced upon him by the rule of white South Africa. It was in this tension, this clash of worlds, that his character began to form. He was intelligent, curious, and determined. Education became his tool. While other boys played, Mandela studied. He learned not just reading and writing, but the value of discipline, honor, and resilience. A boy of the fields, growing into a man of destiny. The boy who once chased cattle in the hills of Kunu now walked through the gates of mission schools, his mind opening to a world far beyond his village. Nelson Mandela's journey of education had begun. Mandela first attended Clarkberry Boarding Institute, the oldest Western-style school for black Africans in Thembuland. Here, he wore a suit for the first time, learned etiquette, and discovered the discipline of structured education. Yet, behind the formal lessons, Mandela carried a dream to rise beyond what society allowed for men of his race. He was hungry, not for food, but for knowledge. Each book he opened was a window into a wider world, each lesson a step toward his future destiny. Later, Mandela joined Healdtown, a Wesleyan college, where he was admired for his manners, his determination, and his seriousness. His teachers saw in him a spark of leadership. At Healdtown, Mandela also learned about Christian values of humility and forgiveness, ideas that would one day influence his fight against oppression. But it was at the University of Fort Hare, the only university for black Africans in South Africa at that time, where Mandela's mind truly awakened. Fort Hare was a place of ambition, filled with young men and women who dreamed of leading Africa into a new dawn. Here, Nelson was no longer just a student. He was becoming a thinker, a debater, a man with vision. At Fort Hare, Mandela studied law and engaged in lively political debates. For the first time, he openly questioned the injustice of white rule. He debated on freedom, equality, and leadership. He began to believe that education was not just for personal success, it was for serving the people. But rebellion was never far from him. When the Student Council organized a boycott against university policies, Mandela joined. For this act of defiance, he was expelled. The troublemaker within him had spoken again. He would not bend to injustice, not even in the classroom. After leaving Fort Hare, Mandela returned home, only to find that his guardian, Chief Jongintaba, had arranged a marriage for him. Mandela, however, was not ready. He wanted freedom to choose his life, his path, and his destiny. So, with his cousin Justice, Mandela made a bold decision. Together, they fled to Johannesburg, the city of gold, where minds glittered and dreams collided. It was a dangerous leap from the quiet hills of the Transkei to the roaring heart of South Africa's industrial world. But it was here, in the crowded streets of Johannesburg, that Nelson Mandela's true awakening would begin. Johannesburg opened Mandela's eyes. He saw black workers treated as inferiors, their labor exploited, while white men grew rich. He saw segregation in buses, in neighborhoods, in jobs, and he felt a deep anger, an anger not of hate, but of justice denied. In Johannesburg, Mandela worked various jobs as a guard, a clerk, even a law apprentice. His hunger for knowledge continued, and he completed his studies through correspondence. Most importantly, he met influential activists who introduced him to the African National Congress, ANC. Here, among thinkers and fighters, Nelson Mandela found his purpose. He was no longer just Nelson, the student. He was becoming Mandela, the freedom fighter. Johannesburg was a city that glittered with gold but bled with injustice. It was here, in the smoke and dust of the mines, in the cramped townships, that Nelson Mandela's transformation from a young man into a revolutionary began. Added, in the early 1940s, Mandela worked as a law clerk while finishing his studies. But outside the office, a new world was calling. The city was alive with movements of resistance, whispers of freedom, and men and women who dreamed of a South Africa without chains. It was during this time that Mandela met Walter Sisulu, a real estate agent who would become his lifelong friend and mentor. Sisulu introduced him to a network of activists, professionals, and political thinkers. Most importantly, he introduced Mandela to the African National Congress, ANC, the oldest liberation movement in South Africa. The ANC was more than an organization. For Mandela, it was a family, a vision, a mission. Here he found men and women who refused to bow before injustice. In 1943, Mandela officially joined the ANC. At first, he was just an observer, learning, listening, absorbing. But soon, his energy, his passion, and his natural leadership brought him into the heart of the struggle. He became part of the ANC Youth League, founded by Anton Lembede, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo. These young men believed that the time for polite petitions was over. They demanded direct action, mass mobilization, and uncompromising resistance against racial oppression. Mandela was no longer the boy from Kunu, no longer just the student from Fort Hare. He was now a man who dared to speak against the system, a man who would fight with words, with law, and with courage. During this time, Mandela also began his legal career. Alongside Oliver Tambo, he opened the first black law firm in South Africa, Mandela and Tambo Attorneys. They defended black South Africans who were mistreated, evicted, or imprisoned under apartheid laws. For many poor Africans, Mandela became a beacon of hope, but his journey was not just professional, it was deeply personal. He married Evelyn Mace, a nurse, and started a family. Yet, even as he loved his children, his heart belonged equally to the struggle. The pull of freedom was stronger than the comfort of home. He had chosen a path of sacrifice, one where love was tested, where family was secondary, and where the dream of justice came before all else. The 1940s and 1950s were years of rising defiance. Mandela organized boycotts, strikes, and protests against unjust laws. He marched in the streets, gave speeches in townships, and inspired thousands to stand up. His voice became a flame in the darkness, and people began to call him a leader. But leadership came with danger. Mandela was arrested multiple times, watched by the police, and marked as a troublemaker by the state. Yet, each arrest only made him stronger. Every time they tried to silence him, his voice grew louder. Every time they put him in chains, his spirit grew freer. By the mid-1950s, Mandela was at the center of the resistance. He played a major role in drafting the Freedom Charter, a powerful document that declared, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white." This vision was radical, dangerous, and beautiful. It was a dream that terrified the rulers of apartheid. The birth of a revolutionary was complete. Nelson Mandela, once a village boy herding cattle, was now a warrior for justice, a leader of his people, and a rising threat to an unjust regime. The 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds were a storm. South Africa was burning with tension, and at the center of it all stood Nelson Mandela, refusing to bend, refusing to break. The apartheid government was tightening its grip. Laws multiplied, banning interracial marriages, forcing black South Africans to carry passbooks, and segregating every aspect of life. The Freedom Charter had lit a spark, but the rulers wanted that fire extinguished. In 1956, Mandela, along with 155 activists, was arrested and charged with high treason. The trial dragged on for years. For Mandela, it was not just a fight for freedom, but a chance to turn the courtroom into a stage for resistance. "You may call me a criminal," he declared, "but history will call me a patriot." Though the charges were eventually dropped in 1961, Mandela's life was under constant threat. He was banned from gatherings, followed by police, and forbidden from speaking publicly. But the more they tried to silence him, the more his voice echoed across the nation. Then came a tragedy that changed everything. The Sharpeville Massacre of 1960. Peaceful protesters had gathered against the passed laws. Police opened fire. 69 people were killed, hundreds wounded. The nation wept, and the world finally turned its eyes toward South Africa. That day, Mandela realized peaceful petitions were no longer enough. The government's language was violence, and to be heard, the people would need a new voice. The government responded by banning the ANC and other liberation movements. Mandela and his comrades were forced underground. He disguised himself, moving from safe house to safe house. Newspapers began to call him the Black Pimpernel, a man who could vanish and reappear at will. But Mandela was not hiding in fear, he was building something new. Along with his comrades, he founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. Their mission was not terror, but sabotage to target government buildings, infrastructure, and symbols of oppression without harming civilians. It was not a choice of anger, but of necessity. When a government denies you peaceful protest, it forces you into resistance. Mandela traveled secretly across Africa, seeking support, training, and allies. He visited Ethiopia, Ghana, Algeria, meeting leaders who had also fought colonialism. He returned to South Africa determined, ready to lead a movement that could no longer be ignored. But fate was closing in. In 1962, Mandela was arrested once again. This time, the charges were more serious, leaving the country without permission, inciting workers to strike. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. And just when the world thought they had finally captured him, police raided a farm in Rivonia, uncovering documents linking Mandela and others to the armed struggle. This time, the stakes were life or death. The struggle had reached a point of no return. Nelson Mandela was no longer just a leader in hiding. He was now a symbol of defiance, standing face to face with the possibility of death. The stage was set for the most famous trial in South African history, the Rivonia trial. The world watched as Nelson Mandela stood in the dock, accused of crimes that carried the death penalty. But instead of pleading for mercy, he delivered words that would echo across centuries. In 1963, police raided Liliesleaf Farm in Rivonia, Johannesburg. They uncovered documents proving that Mandela and his comrades had planned acts of sabotage against the apartheid state. This became known as the Rivonia trial. Mandela, already serving a sentence, now faced charges that could end his life. But on the 20th of April 1964, in the Pretoria Supreme Court, Mandela gave his legendary speech, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society, in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live and to see realized. But, my lord, if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The courtroom fell silent. The government wanted to paint him as a terrorist, but he had become something much greater, a martyr in waiting, a global voice for justice. In June 1964, Mandela and his comrades were sentenced, not to death, but to life imprisonment. He was sent to the infamous Robben Island, a barren, wind-swept prison in the sea, reserved for South Africa's most dangerous enemies of the state. Behind those gray prison walls, Mandela's fight did not end. It only transformed. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners were forced into hard labor, breaking rocks under the burning Sunday. Food was scarce and deliberately poor. Communication with the outside world was strictly limited. Mandela was confined to a small, damp cell, just 8 feet by 7 feet. A thin mat on the floor was his bed. A bucket served as his toilet. Letters were censored, visits rare. Yet, in those walls, Mandela built a new kind of freedom. He studied. He taught. He debated. Robben Island became known as the University of Robben Island, because Mandela and his comrades educated one another, sharpening their minds and spirits. They thought prison would break him. Instead, it shaped him into the leader who would one day rebuild a nation. Outside, the apartheid regime grew more isolated. International pressure mounted. Sanctions were imposed. Artists, leaders, and ordinary citizens across the world began to chant, "Free Nelson Mandela." Songs were written. Protests filled the streets of London, New York, and Paris. Mandela, locked away, became the face of a global movement for justice. But inside prison, the years rolled on. 10 years. 20 years. Mandela missed the funerals of his mother and his son. He endured loneliness, sickness, and the weight of forgotten time. Yet he never gave in. Courage is not the absence of fear, Mandela would later say, but the triumph over it. By the 1980 seconds, South Africa was on the edge of collapse. The economy was bleeding. International pressure was unbearable. Uprisings inside the country grew fiercer. The government realized they could not rule forever with chains and guns. Secret negotiations began, and at the center of every demand from the people was one name: Nelson Mandela. After 27 years in prison, on the 11th of February 1990, Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison, hand in hand with his wife Winnie, raising his fist high into the air. It was not just a man walking free, it was history breaking its chains. The crowd roared, the world wept. South Africa had not yet healed, but hope had returned. On the 11th of February 1990, the gates of Victor Verster prison swung open. The world held its breath. And then, there he was, Nelson Mandela, walking slowly, proudly, hand in hand with Winnie, his fist raised high in triumph. The moment was electric. Millions watched on live television. Crowds filled the streets. Some cried, some danced. For nearly 3 decades, Mandela had been a prisoner. Now, he was free. But freedom came with heavy responsibility. South Africa was a nation on fire. Violence between groups, fear among communities, and a fragile government struggling to hold power. Mandela was stepping into chaos. Mandela's first speech in Cape Town became legendary. Standing on the balcony of the City Hall, he addressed the sea of supporters. "I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. Today, we are free, but the struggle is not yet over. We must now build the foundation of a democratic and just South Africa." His words were not filled with revenge. Instead, they were filled with reconciliation, forgiveness, and hope. That was Mandela's greatest strength. He could see beyond pain into possibility. Mandela soon began talks with President F.W. de Klerk and the apartheid government. It was not easy. Decades of hatred and bloodshed could not be erased with a handshake. There were moments of anger, moments of betrayal, and violent outbreaks across the country. But Mandela's patience, wisdom, and moral authority kept the talks alive. He urged his people to stay the course. Courageous people do not fear forgiving, for the sake of peace. The world admired his calm, his dignity, and his refusal to let vengeance rule his heart. South Africa, however, was trembling. Political assassinations shook the streets. Massacres and riots threatened to derail peace. Some leaders wanted war. Others wanted to abandon negotiations. But Mandela stood firm. He knew that only democracy, true democracy, could save South Africa. Behind closed doors, he argued with generals, calmed rebels, and reassured fearful communities. He was building not just agreements, but trust. Toward the first free election, finally, after years of talks, struggle, and international pressure, the moment came. In April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. For the first time in history, black and white South Africans stood side by side in long lines, waiting for hours to cast their vote. The image of the elderly, who had waited their entire lives for this moment, brought tears to the eyes of the world. It was more than an election. It was the rebirth of a nation. Mandela elected president. On the 10th of May, 1994, Nelson Mandela stood at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, sworn in as the first black president of South Africa. World leaders gathered. Millions cheered. Mandela's dream had become reality. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. Let freedom reign. The applause echoed not just across South Africa, but across the globe. On the 10th of May 1994, Nelson Mandela stood under the bright South African sun, sworn in as the first black president of his country. The journey from prisoner to president was not just a personal victory, it was the triumph of an entire nation. Mandela's presidency was not about revenge. It was about healing. He surprised many by including former political opponents in his government. He worked alongside President F.W. de Klerk, his old adversary, in a government of national unity. Courage is not the absence of fear, it's inspiring others to move beyond it. By embracing his enemies, Mandela showed the world that reconciliation was stronger than hatred. One of Mandela's most powerful initiatives was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Instead of punishing every crime of apartheid with prison, Mandela believed in exposing the truth, allowing victims to be heard, and giving perpetrators a chance to confess. The process was painful. Tears, anger, and broken stories filled the hearings. But through truth came healing. Mandela understood the power of symbols. He famously wore the jersey of South Africa's rugby team, the Springboks, once seen as a symbol of white supremacy. When he presented the World Cup trophy to Captain Francois Pienaar in 1995, the stadium erupted in unity. Sport has the power to change the world. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. That single moment brought black and white South Africans together in celebration. Mandela's government faced enormous challenges: rebuilding an economy broken by decades of sanctions, reducing poverty and inequality, fighting the HIV divided by AIDS crisis that was devastating the population. He could not solve every problem. He was no miracle worker, but he laid the foundation for a democratic South Africa. Most importantly, Mandela stepped down after one term. In a continent where leaders often clung to power, Mandela chose to walk away, proving that true leadership is about service, not control. Even after leaving office, Mandela remained a global figure of peace and justice. He campaigned for AIDS awareness, human rights, and children's education. He became a voice of conscience in a noisy world. What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is the difference we have made to the lives of others. On the 5th of December 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. The world mourned. Leaders from every corner of the globe attended his funeral. Millions paid tribute. But his spirit lived on in the laughter of children, in the freedom of a nation, in the hope of humanity. Death is something inevitable. When a man has done what he considers to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. Mandela rested, but his legacy, justice, forgiveness, courage, lives forever. Nelson Mandela's life is proof that no prison can hold the human spirit, and no hatred can silence the voice of justice. From prisoner to president, from victim to victor, his journey is the story of hope itself, and it reminds us, each of us, in our own way, can choose peace over violence, unity over division, and love over fear.